welcome. I'm going to introduce Platypus briefly. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s and 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. At NYU, we run a weekly reading group on Thursdays from 6 to 9. It's on this floor in the lounge down the corridor there. We also have a weekly coffee break that runs from 6 to 9 on Tuesdays in the Bean by Astor Place. And we also have reading groups and coffee breaks at the New School in Columbia and at other chapters around the States and Europe. Tonight's panel is entitled, What is Marxism For? And we've asked the panelists to respond to the following prompt. The legacy and future of Marxism, both as a guiding theory and a political movement of human freedom, has questionable utility to our current political moment. While the relevance of the 19th century critique of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels continues to be felt, as evidenced by the continued return of the question of socialism in leftist politics, the success of the Marxist project of human freedom feels far from certain or secure. The memory of the 20th century communism, as well as more recent political movements carrying the banner of socialism, weighs heavily on any political movement that today attempts to attend to the task Marx outlined close to 200 years ago. In contemporary leftist political action, Marxism has been invoked to justify supporting the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, participating in the Black Lives Matter movement, resisting the Trump presidency, and anti-fascism. It begs the question for us today, what is Marxism for the left? And what does it accomplish for contemporary leftist politics? What is the relevance of Marxism today? Is there a necessity to recover or return to Marxism? And what would it mean to go beyond it? What is the point of leadership by Marxist intellectuals? Is that necessary? The structure of the panel will be that the panelists will each give opening remarks. Then the panelists will have the chance to respond to each other's opening remarks, and then we'll open things up to Q&A. So I'll present the panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. Rossen Jagalo teaches in the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies here at NYU. He's a historian of the left. He's the author of From Internationalism to Post-Colonialism, Literature and Cinema Between the Second and Third World, and an editor of LeftEast, a web magazine of the East European and post-Soviet left. Howie Hawkins is a retired Teamster in Syracuse, New York. He's been active in movements for civil rights, peace, labor, and the environment since the 1960s. He's a co-founder of the U.S. Green Party in 1984, and he was the party's candidate for U.S. president in 2020. And then we finally have Eli Zaretsky, who teaches at the New School and is the author of Why America Needs a Left, and Capitalism, the Family, and Social Life.
Personal life.
Personal life, forgive me. Without further ado, I'd like to say, I guess you each have about 10 minutes for your opening remarks, and then, we'll discuss. Go ahead.
Great, so I'm going to speak about the importance of looking at Marxism and Marxist struggle specifically as a historical tradition, because I come from a left without a tradition or a history to ground it, a left without mothers and fathers, and I'm very conscious of my politically orphaned upbringing. And this is really not a very good place to be coming from. So as Oliver mentioned, I am an editor of LeftEast, a magazine of the post-Soviet bloc left. This year we are celebrating our 10th anniversary. Otherwise, there is not that much to celebrate. A young Marxist left does exist in almost every East European and post-Soviet country, which certainly wasn't the case a decade ago. And in some former Yugoslav countries, such as Slovenia and Croatia, this left has achieved parliamentary representation. Elsewhere, it has the form of disparate organizations around capital cities, but nowhere is it a generationally diverse movement with significant working class participation. So my remarks will be focused on our dirtiest and most embarrassing secret, that intellectually our Marxism is, or at least began as, largely a Western import, a product of our encounter with the Western left and Western academia. The suicide Communist Party leadership spectacularly performed in the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries around 1990 was a blow to the left globally, even to those parts of it hostile to the Soviet-style tradition. But for the left that would eventually emerge in former state socialist countries, this moment left a scorched earth, namely former communist parties rapidly adapting to neoliberalism, tiny Stalinist currents that we may have been a little too hostile to, and a popular nostalgia for state socialism that initially we did not know how to engage or repoliticize. Thus we are a generational phenomenon coming across Western Marxism while studying abroad in the late 90s or 2000s, or reading it at home in translation. We owe a great deal to the likes of David Harvey and Etienne Balibar, Silvia Federici and Michael Burawoy, Emmanuel Wallerstein and many others, but our initial over-reliance on them, entirely a fault of our own, has distanced us from the working classes in our societies. It is, for example, very difficult to try to address a mass audience if you're speaking a translated language, citing examples that sound way too foreign to most people's experience. To overcome this, most recently, many of us have been turning to our own history, the history of socialist movement struggles in our own societies. Of course, it is much easier if you're a Russian and could claim the Bolshevik Revolution as your inheritance, or could learn from left-wing Soviet dissidents, some of whom are still around. Or if you're an ex-Yugoslav who could legitimately take pride in your country's experience of worker self-management or its place in the non-aligned movement. It is a little more difficult if you're a Bulgarian or a Romanian and state socialism came to your countries in 1944 on the back of Soviet tanks, largely overshadowing a pre-existing tradition of Marxist thought and struggle. But these days, many of us are trying to recover that tradition, as well as examine the whole experience of state socialism, which initially at least we had been shying away from, leaving it to the monopoly of anti-communist liberals to interpret. There are not only costly mistakes and bitter lessons to learn from that experience, but also of state socialism, but also a lot to rehabilitate about it. All of this, of course, is not to say that we should be aspiring after some kind of a national Bulgarian or regional East European Marxism, or that we should be necessarily challenging the Western Marxist hegemony within the whole field. But greater interest in indigenous traditions of struggle is one of the many prerequisites to breaking out of our current state of growing but still overwhelmingly academic milieu. I realize this is a very specific parochial story of limited relevance to the questions the left in the US is facing today. And God knows an excess of foreign translation or bloated knowledge of foreign struggles is not American left's main problem. But I do suspect there are some parts of the world, especially places within the global south, where the left has been similarly destroyed and traditions of local Marxist analysis and local Marxist struggles have been similarly erased, as they have been in the former Second World. And maybe our current efforts to reconnect with those historical traditions in the former Soviet bloc could still resonate with comrades from there, whose Marxism has been similarly peripheral. So that would
Where
be
are you from?
Bulgaria.
Bulgaria. Do you think it's possible for me to get think it's possible for me to get some water.
Yeah, sure, sure.
You, Natalie, please? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hawkins, if you'd like to go next.
Okay, thank you. Look, I believe Marxism remains very relevant today for its analysis and critique of capitalism as a structure of competitive accumulation that generates enduring fundamental social problems that are built into the capitalist system. Now, I come at this, at Marxism, as an activist, not an academic. And I found it, very useful for a general framework to orient toward the problems that we face. Ironically, I got most of my education in Marx from an anarchist, Murray Bookchin, who called himself an eco-anarchist, a communalist, a libertarian socialist at different times. And he never called himself a Marxist. But I can tell you, he used to say Marx was a fucking genius. And all his, all the complete, what do they call it? The total works of Marx and Engels, it's like, fits the whole bookshelf. He read through it about 3 times. He knew Marx inside and out. And, like anarchists that were contemporary with Marx, Bakunin and Kropotkin, they drew on Marx's critique of capitalism, even as the anarchists criticized aspects of the politics of Marx and of subsequent Marxist movements, particularly for people like Bookchin. So in any case, I come at this for the understanding I get of social problems, and there are 5 I would like to identify that you can take out of a Marxist analysis that helps you understand them. The first is inequality. Capitalism's wage-labor relationship exploits working people by robbing them of the full value of their labor and transfers that wealth to the owning class. So the wages system generates inequality and economic insecurity. Second thing, economic tyranny and alienation. When you go to work in a tyrannical corporation. There's, no democracy. So, working people are stripped of their freedom, their creativity is dismissed, their self-worth is degraded, and that oppression spills out over into social, civic, and political life in alienation and passivity. Third problem is economic crises and insecurity. And without outlining Marx's and subsequent Marxian crisis theories, there's overproduction, chronic stagnation, and then financialization and debt crises. The end result of this is a further concentration of wealth after crises with the capitalists. So inequality and economic security grow out of these economic crises. The fourth fundamental problem is environmental destruction. Capitalism is a grow-or-die competitive structure. Every firm, every country's trying to get bigger in order to compete better and survive. And that imparts a growth dynamic that has no sense of balance or reciprocity with the environment, with ecosystems, and it's destroying them. And the fifth one is imperialism and war. Capitalism's competitive structure yields a conflict-ridden international system where nation states, at the behest of their own corporations, giving them impetus, go to war for resources, labor, markets, and geopolitical military positioning. And sooner or later, in this world today, it's going to lead to nuclear annihilation if we don't change the system. So how do we change the system? I think there are 3 things I take away from Marx and the Marxist tradition here. The first is independent working class political action. Marx and Engels and their comrades were very clear after the pro-democracy revolutions of 1948. And what happened in coalitions between workers and more middle-class elements was that the workers need to have their own party to take care of their own interests and advance their own program. Now, that's why I've been active in the Green Party, which never was, or wasn't until recently, explicitly socialist. But it was independent of the two-capitalist party system. And I thought that was good enough. You know, the advice that Engels gave to Marxists in 1886 when they were looking at Henry George's Labor Party campaign here in New York City, and the Marxists were saying he's not a socialist. But Engels said, well, he's progressive, but the important thing is the independence of the Labor Party. And over time, the workers fighting for their interests and their needs will, come to a more developed, more coherent socialist program. And I think that's what's happened with the Green Party. I mean, for the last 8 years now, it's been explicitly eco-socialist and deepening that, program in its platform. So I think it has worked out that way. And yes, I know a lot of people, and this was in the prompt, referencing Sanders and the Squad. They say nice things about democratic socialism, but actually what they're promoting is kind of New Deal liberalism. And in the end, I think the net effect is they make the Democratic Party look better than it really is, because they are the tail on the Democratic donkey. They're not, the tail isn't wagging the donkey's wagging the tail. So that's the first lesson. Second lesson is international socialist solidarity, which I think the Marxist tradition in the US in particular, and maybe internationally, really has gone off the path. We see a lot of Marxists making geopolitical analyses of state interests and deciding which competing capitalist camp they want to support, rather than a class analysis of who's oppressed and who the oppressors are. And I think the most clearest example of that is Ukraine. You get all these excuses. They say, yeah, it was wrong for Russia to invade Ukraine, but NATO expansion provoked it, so it's a US-NATO proxy war against Russia. And what did the Ukrainians say? Particularly their progressive movements, their labor movements. They want to fight for themselves. And instead of being in solidarity with the working class in Ukraine, a lot of the Marxists, and we can talk about who I'm talking about if you want, are saying, we oppose solidarity with Ukraine. No economic aid, no arms, let Russia do what it will. So I think that is in direct contradiction. That Marx now analyzed capitalism as a global system, an expanding system, and the answer was work of the world unite, and that's what we're not doing. And then the third thing I would say, my last thing, is that this gets to the question of the role of Marxist intellectuals. I'm not really aware of any Marx or Engels theorizing on the role of intellectuals directly, but their example was they were both activists and intellectuals, and they tried to impart what they knew to the movement. And anarchists then and now were sometimes critical of Marx and some of his autocratic moves within the First International, and the Marxists can say some things about some of the anarchists too in the same regard. But his emphasis on a centralized revolutionary state in the first stages of socialism was criticized by the anarchist wing. At other times, Marx was in agreement. The anarchists and him agreed about the Paris Commune, which was a bottom-up federated structure, which was more like what the anarchists had advocated. But given the history of communist parties establishing one-party police states with vanguard parties supposedly guiding the workers to socialism, the role of the intelligentsia has become problematic on the left. And now what I believe, and I really got this from Murray Bookchin, is that we need an intelligentsia that's embedded in left movements but do not see themselves as the future rulers of a revolutionary state. Instead, they play a catalytic role, not a controlling role, in spreading ideas and encouraging people to think for themselves and build a movement from below for the full political and economic democracy that we have in the socialist vision.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, what is Marxism? What do we mean by Marxism? Secondly, why is it important? Why is it still valid and important, which I think it is? And then third, what are the problems with it? So what Marxism is and why it's unique, and it can't be replaced by radical economics or many other possibilities. What Marxism is it's a theory of capitalism as a form of history, as something that emerged in history. It's a theory of capitalism as social and political. It's about the emergence of the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class and how it establishes its rule, and about the emergence of the working class, the relationship of the bourgeoisie to the working class, and so forth. It is not an economic theory. Marx calls his book Critique of Political Economy. He is constantly arguing against the economists of his time. That's, I think, is the most important thing to understand about Marxism, and why it's unique, because there is no other conception of capitalism, which is, after all, the fundamental social form of the modern world, is capitalism. It's the infrastructure of the modern world. There's no other way to understand it except through, the basic kind of approach that Marx took, which is not to understand it as an economic system, is to understand it as a social system, political aspects, and so and so forth. Now, there are Marxists who develop economic theories and so forth. I am not a big fan of that, but I'm not. That's fine. They're also within the framework of people. I think almost everybody who would call themselves a Marxist in a serious way would agree with what I'm saying about Marxism here. Now, these people who call themselves Marxists, and a lot of them were listed at the beginning, like, Balabar and not Murray Bookchin, who is a great figure, and so forth, but not a Marxist. Emmanuel Wallerstein, David Harvey, Nancy Fraser, they all have different theories about capitalism. They all have different ways of understanding it, but they can talk to one another. But it is all within this framework of understanding capitalism as something that emerged at a particular historical moment, has a particular historical shape, something that has to be understood in terms of the social relations and, to some extent, the political relations that characterize capitalism, and not as an economic system, which is how it presents itself. It presents itself as an economic system, the most efficient economic system, so how else would you organize an economy except through supply and demand and so forth? But that is not what Marx was trying to show about capitalism. Why do we need a theory like that? I'm an historian, and if you study history, you see that, capitalism really gets going. It has early development in the 17th century and so forth with slavery, and we're not even going to talk about slavery, maybe, or maybe we should. But it really gets going in a major way with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And then you have something like World War I. World War I, 10 million young people, kids your own age, were killed in World War I. No one knows to this day what caused World War I. It's not like World War II where you have a Hitler who comes along. No one knows what happened. The only way to understand it is to understand how powerful capitalism as a social and political force is. It wasn't the economics of it. It wasn't like England, was going to, had to defeat the Germans because they would get a few more dollars. That's true or not true, whatever. There was some of that. It isn't that. It is that the capitalist dynamic created states that only thought in terms of their own growth, their own aggrandizement. They had no sense, and this is the essence of capitalism. There's no sense of the whole. There's no sense of how to balance things one against another and so forth. And you just had a kind of blind going forth, and you had the war. We talk about World War II. Afterward, it's not exactly the same, but it's actually quite a complicated story. Let me kind of mention some things from our own age. Climate change. You've got a kind of disaster. I'm not an expert on the climate. Maybe it's not as bad as people say, and so forth, or maybe it is. But the one thing I could tell you is that no one is no one in power is really looking out, because you have this driving force. No one actually thought when we started in with fossil fuels, well, gee, maybe we should ration these, maybe we should control these, because you don't do that under capitalism. I'm not saying capitalism has never been able to control things. It has been able to control a few things, but very rarely, like poison gas was forbade during World War I and so forth. It is still forbidden, but very, very little. I mean, climate change is a good example of, I'm trying to explain why we need Marxism to understand how you could have something so irrational as, destroying the climate, if in fact that's what we're doing. We just had another, perfectly good example of why we need Marxism and why we need a conception of capitalism, and why capitalism is not enough to solve our problems with artificial intelligence, with the Sam Altman thing, where people were saying we have to slow this down because we're going to start getting robots that are going to start going out killing people or blowing things up and so forth. And you understand that was what OpenAI was. There was an effort to slow down the development of artificial intelligence because of the dangers, the same as with climate change, the same as the kind of things that caused World War I. Maybe you have to slow something down, and so you just can't do that under capitalism. You could say, and this is, to me, is a really important lesson. I love Bernie Sanders. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders is a really great man, and I mean, calling him a New Deal liberal to me, is not such a bad thing. The New Deal was fantastic. You would think after the New Deal, where they supported trade unions, they made it so that you had every right to have a trade union. The bosses had to open up the factories and have elections and so forth were required. Where they created Social Security, where they built the university system, they created the whole middle class. You would think that after something like that, you would just keep going with social reform and social justice, because we learned what government could do in the 1930s. We learned how powerful a government that was not afraid of business, defined business as basically the enemy, which Roosevelt did in the 1930s. We learned what we could do, and so forth. And yet, they took it all back. They took back the trade unions. Now it's coming back again, but they took back most of the power that trade unions had for decades. They took back, they threatened Social Security. They threatened, school debt, and all of these things that have been, created, since the rollback. So that's what capitalism is like. It's not like, you give it an inch and it gives you an inch back and you compromise. No, you give it an inch and it will eat up your entire arm. So the people who say we really don't need Marxism, we really don't have to think that way because we can reform things and so forth, are really not looking at the historical picture where we've tried that. We tried to reform capitalism, and once the capitalists had a toe in the door, they took back all the reforms, or most of the reforms. What are the problems with Marxism? Well, I mean, the first thing is, I'm saying Marxism is something that's very specific. It's not the same as the left. The left is a much broader, diverse thing. The left is not the same as Marxism. Thank God for the left. The left is the best thing in the modern world, in my view. We should all be proud, to be identified with it. That's not the same as Marxism. Marxism is not the same as the history of economics, as, for example, Sven Beckert and other people produce it. So Marxism is very specific. Was the Bolshevik Revolution Marxist, as they claim to be? You know, I won't even get into that question. But there is no way around, if you are a leftist and if you have any feeling for Marxism, and so we have to deal with the experience of the Soviet Union. We have to deal with the tragedy of Stalin and the whole thing, and there are no excuses. I mean, there was a backward country, Stalin was a terrible man, and so there are no excuses. And what I think I would draw from that, Marx was a genius. He was terrific, you know, and he read everything. And he didn't think that he had all the answers. He was trying to do one very specific thing, which is to re-understand capitalism, not as an economic system, but in social terms. He read Darwin. He read Morgan, the anthropologist. He read Balzac. He wanted to write a book about Balzac, about the psychology of Paris in the 19th century, based on Balzac's novels. And in the same way, Marxism is not enough to deal with these things. So I think that there are some basic problems that are raised by the tragedy of the Soviet Union that require us to think beyond Marx. There are questions about political justice, about rights, about the necessity of markets. That's not the same as capitalism. To have markets is not the same as capitalism. I myself study psychoanalysis. I believe psychoanalysis, both in terms of understanding individuals, but in terms of understanding masses, has a lot to offer. So we have a long way to go before we could say, you know, that we've actually, you know, and I mean, there is a lot in the liberal tradition that protects against the kind of thing, or tries to protect against the kind of thing that happened in the Soviet Union. And those are things that we can learn from and draw upon. So I'll stop there.
Rossen, so I guess now each of the panelists are going to have 5 minutes to respond to each other's remarks. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, it's really been an education listening to both of you. And, you know, I am in almost full agreement, and there's not, you know, if you expect some kind of polemic from me, probably you'll be disappointed. But I'll just pick up on some motifs from first Howie's talk and then Eli's, and then maybe something interesting could come out of there. But first, I'm absolutely in full agreement with Howie's point about international solidarity and how all too often we leftists, you know, approach the world with some kind of preconceived geopolitics and some kind of a main enemy we have in mind, whether that's in the United States or you know, some other power, and align our political vision in opposition to that, without actually conducting a close Marxist analysis of actually existing social relations on the ground. And that's of course a much more difficult process, and of course most of us not living in the places where we have to perform that operation for cannot do it, but at least I think it is incumbent to you know, not to start from some basic geopolitics, but from a on the ground class analysis that examines the societies concerned closely. Yes, and also in full agreement with Howie's point about the relationship between the intelligentsia and the working classes, which in most Marxist movements or parties these days, has there are of course some exceptions, but has shifted very much. The power and the numbers have shifted in the direction of intellectuals, which is a major problem if these are to be supposedly working class parties fighting for working class interests. And we know the history of that in the Western world. The famous clash of hard heads and soft heads somewhere further south in Manhattan in the United States, that emblematized that kind of tension of these two components of the left, really, rather than specifically Marxism, but in the places where I come from, the Eastern Europe, this has really reached a grotesque dimension with really very, very few working class people involved in any Marxist organization, which are dominated by academics, and this is really a situation, we've been trying to think how to reverse, but it's, and yes, I absolutely agree with Howie's point that, it's really not a new problem. Marx and Engels were very much aware of it, being consummate intellectuals themselves, trying to facilitate the birth of a working class movement, but I think the kind of mass working class parties that did exist early in the 20th century are no more, and that that's really a major problem to try to reverse. I will only very briefly address Eli's points about the problems of Marxism, and maybe here while largely in agreement with him, here maybe I have to confess my definition of Marxism is far more expansive, and in the sense that I do look even upon Stalin as a Marxist. I mean, certainly a wrong-headed one, certainly, with somebody whose role in the international Marxist movement led to disastrous consequences. But I do think of, his thinking as
Who?
Stalin.
Oh, sorry.
As fundamentally, is drawing on a Marxist tradition and arriving at some very unfortunate conclusions. But so I look upon, it would have been to me, very pleasant to have to excise Stalinism, as some kind of a distortion and not to have to worry about that problem. But to me, it is a problem that internal to Marxism, and that we as Marxists should take seriously, and the whole of state socialism similarly, to me would be, I look at it as part of.
I agree with you. I didn't mean to exclude Stalin from. I mean, I know I raised the question and so forth, but I'm perfectly happy to, to grant the point. But it points to my deeper point, which is that Marxism by itself is not enough. There are a lot of other things that we have to understand and so forth. that was a huge problem. I've studied a little bit, the history of Soviet communism, and people that I really, really worshipped, like Isaac Deutscher, the biographer of Trotsky, somebody who I really admired. Deutscher, at the end of his biography of Trotsky, he says, if Trotsky gets published in the Soviet Union, that will change everything. People will see everything differently. Stalin was so terrible, but Trotsky had the right ideas, he says, and so forth. When I studied Deutscher, I found that he he felt that socialization of the means of production in the Soviet Union was such an incredible human advance that the killing of tens of millions of people in gulags and so forth was worth it. Well, obviously, that was wrong. Is there anything in Marxism that would tell you that gulags are wrong? No. It's not about gulags. But so that that just means we can't just be like Stalin was. Marxism is everything. That was his mistake. Not whether he was a Marxist or not, but he didn't understand that an advance like socialization of the means of production, which would be an incredible human advance, rests on an understanding of the history of liberal rights and individual freedom and democracy and many, many other things that that Stalin, didn't, pay any attention to, nor did Deutscher.
But many other Marxist currents didn't. If we think of, and this is why maybe I'm thinking also of Marxism more broadly, because socialist humanism of the 1960s was very engaged in the project of looking at some, basic liberal values and seeing the merger of the points, or there is this major tradition of which you're part of, Marxism and Freudianism, and so to me, ideally Marxism is a living and breathing thought that really, upon its encounters with various other bodies of thought, be they feminism or, is willing to take the insights on board.
I agree with that. I agree with that, and I mean there are fantastic people in the history of East European communism and Soviet communism, people from the 60s and so forth, and even someone like Gorbachev, I would say was a great figure. So yeah.
What do you think, Howie?
Well, a couple themes here I'd like to address that have come out. Question of going beyond Marxism, which I completely agree with. I mean, I just outlined what I think we can get from Marxism in terms of understanding the problems in the world today and how we should go about changing the world to deal with those problems. But I think Eli brought up a number of questions that Marxism doesn't have answers for, that we got to go beyond. I mean, when I worked with Murray Bookchin in the 70s and 80s, that's what we were talking about. I mean, we read Marx and Engels and study groups he had and whatnot in order to go beyond. We just come out of the SDS period, and you may have seen or know about Murray Bookchin's polemic called "Listen, Marxist!" ! Which was addressed to the last SDS convention. I mean, we had these instant Marxist-Leninists among the student movement who really didn't know what they were talking about, but we had this Maoist group, Progressive Labor, come in, and they were very disruptive. So a counterforce that became, one of the factions became Weatherman, or, in their little, bombings of, the Capitol Hill toilet and whatnot. And, you know, most of us in SDS, you know, we weren't with either faction. We were more with the, you know, theme of participatory democracy and community control. So, but that's what, you know, instant Marxists ended up doing. And, you know, we, besides reading Marx and Engels, we studied revolutions, you know, the revolutions of 1848, the Paris Commune, the German Revolution, the Spanish Revolution during the Spanish Civil War, in 1968 in Paris, you know, and was that a revolutionary movement? I mean, my generation sometimes called the 68ers. That was, you know, kind of our peak moment. And then, you know, the question of whether there are things in Marx and Engels that could lead towards Stalinism. You know, read Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and he's very much about centralization, authority, partly to repress the counter-revolution. On the other hand, you can read Lenin, State and Revolution is practically an anarchist vision of, you know, how the government should be structured after the revolution. So anyway, I'm just affirming that, you know, we got to think through some of these questions that, you know, Marx and Engels and the Marxian tradition still haven't resolved. The other thing is, yeah, I agree. You know, Bernie Sanders is a pretty good guy given who's down there in Congress. I've known him since the early 70s when he was running as a third-party candidate in Vermont. But it, you know, and when I, you know, criticize the New Deal liberalism, it looks good today compared to neoliberalism that we have. I grant you that. And, you know, the problem with if you don't go beyond that, to socialize the means of production, to take power from the capitalists so they can't pull back the reforms you've won, means you're still in a capitalist system where they can do that. And that's where, you know, I think, you know, Bernie and the squad and others have really not, you know, put forward a socialist vision. It's reforms. Now, you know, the reforms worth fighting for. I won't argue with that, but, you know, coming out of the New Left, we had a whole critique of New Deal, you know, welfare state. It was centralized, it was bureaucratic, it was not accountable. And because it was within a capitalist system, it could be cut back. We had, you know, participatory democracy, community control were kind of watchwords. So we had come out with reforms by the 70s. I mean, the more policy-oriented people coming out of SDS, you know, particularly early SDS, were coming up with visions for not just national health insurance, which we called the Great Leap Sideways, where the private for-profit medical companies would feed it the public trough of public insurance and not deal with the problems we were facing there of cost control. We had inflation. It looks small compared to today, but it was an issue in the early 70s. And not covering everybody or not getting medical resources into disadvantaged communities. So what came out of the New Left, out of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which were the doctors who were in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, and they came out with a draft of a national health service where not just the insurance, but the delivery, the organization was socialized and democratized. So hospitals and clinics were public, healthcare providers were public employees, and it was governed by a democratically elected system of boards. So, and it would drive healthcare into disadvantaged communities. So every community of 25 to 50,000 would elect a board to oversee a community health clinic. The community would elect two-thirds of the board, and the healthcare providers would elect 1/3. And then that board would send 2 consumers and 1 worker to a district board, which would oversee a general hospital, basically. And then the next level was a regional medical center, you know, which would cover, you know, all the specialties and doctor education and nurse education and so forth. And finally, the national level. And so it was a bottom-up democratic structure. Same thing with public energy. You know, actually, in the early 70s, the question of nationalizing the oil companies and the whole energy system was on the table. Henry Jackson, this neocon hawk, who was a kind of more New Deal liberal on domestic policy, was calling for it during the oil crisis, you know, in the early 70s. There was a proposal for a public energy system that one of the senators from Montana, Lee Metcalf, put in the congressional record, and that also provided for elected boards for public energy districts, which would federate at the state level. This was a model legislation for Vermont. So that was going beyond the New Deal. And so, the situation we're in now is people can't even conceive of that new left critique, and proposals have largely been lost. And so what we got now, it's like, the civilian climate corps, which the Sunrise Movement, was pushing in particular. That model is neoliberal. It's not even New Deal. In the New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps was a public agency, and the people working in it were public employees, and they were able to plan where to deploy the resources and labor to do the environmental work. The Civilian Climate Corps, as it's been conceived and now beginning to be implemented, is privatized. AmeriCorps is going to run it. Nonprofits and local governments will put in grant proposals. They're supposed to help disadvantaged communities, but people in disadvantaged communities are not the people writing the grants, evaluating the grants, and making decisions about the grants. So there's a whole layer of bureaucracy there, and it's uncoordinated. So the overall deployment of this conservation corps depends on what proposals are approved by this AmeriCorps bureaucracy, and then it gets funded, and the private sector does the work, or maybe local government does some of it. So you see the difference. That's kind of a privatized neoliberal version versus what we had in the New Deal, let alone a bottom-up democracy to oversee that public agency, which the New Left was talking about. So, yeah, I'm just commenting on, my critique of Bernie is 2 cheers for Bernie, but we got to go further.
All right, I guess all of you have responded to each other. If there's anything else you might want to say, or we could just open it up to questions.
Yeah, open it up.
All right, I'm gonna steal the first question, but then everyone else can go ahead. I guess it's it seems to me like you guys maybe all share a certain, I feel as though in everything that's been said, there's been a specific gap, which has been the Second International, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg. I guess some of you guys touched on Trotsky, but it seemed to me as though Marx and Marxism wasn't just trying to explain capitalism, but it was pointing to and trying to further a specific political task and a specific form of pursuing politics. And it seems to me as though maybe all of you draw from Marxism, and all of you think that Marxism teaches people a lot, but that it's ultimately lacking something that maybe, I don't know, the New Left might supplement, for instance, the New Left, maybe something else, but that's my question. The Second International and Lenin, and maybe Marxism, there's Marxist politics.
I mean, I think, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what your question is. What is the place of politics within Marxism? I think, Marx, in the 19th century, there was only one country that had universal male suffrage. That was France, I think after 1848. Most countries were run by little elites. The Second International developed because, and that's why World War I was so important, because the industrialization developed, and you started to pile up the cities with huge numbers of people, and then they sent them to war during World War I. They had to give them the vote, and they had to give them, some benefits. So Marx doesn't really understand politics. He doesn't. I mean, he has some ideas about dictatorship of the proletariat and so forth. But it scarcely amounts to a theory of politics. And I think one thing that is extremely important to understand is what happens in the 20th century, because what happens in the 20th century is that politics is totally transformed by fascism. And what is fascism? I mean, you know, we have it in the United States. We just saw it elected in Argentina. We just saw it elected in the Netherlands. You know, it's probably the dominant political force. So in the 20th century, you have something that you really don't have in the 19th century, which are these very, very powerful, irrational mass movements. And that's one thing that we have to understand about the failure of communism. In the Soviet Union, it was in that environment of, you know, Hitler and Mussolini and so forth. And that's why the New Deal was so important, because the New Deal was presenting a kind of democratic liberal alternative to fascism. The problem is that the two people who were, you know, the two great fascists of the 20th century were Hitler and Mussolini. Neither one of them won an election. They were both put in power by the liberals. And we see the same thing in the United States. As you got, especially with Obama, as you got a kind of pro-business liberalism, you get fascism as a response to it. There's a good argument to be made that that the power of fascism, the irrational power of people feeling like we're all the same, the paranoia, people are stealing from us, the anti-immigrant qualities, which we see in India, we see it with Modi, we see it in country after country. We see how easy it is for people to just deprive their fellow citizens of civil liberties. How easy it is to throw people in jail if they're a different color from you or a different ethnicity from you or whatever. We see it in country after country. So one of the biggest questions is, how do you oppose that? And I really don't think we're going to be able to oppose it without socialism.
You also
Well,
you don't need to
Is that
respond.
an answer to you?
Yes.
Okay, good.
You don't need to respond if you don't have any. Yeah.
Yeah, we want to get the audience.
Yeah,
to-
of course.
Well, when I think of the Second International, I think of the debate on reform and revolution. You know, Edward Bernstein said, I forget the phrase, "In the movement is everything, the end is nothing," something like that. You know, he
Right.
thought we'd get to socialism by gradual, incremental
Right.
reforms. And people like Rosa Luxemburg said, you know, the capitalists aren't going to let you do that.
Right.
That at some point it's going to come to revolution. And one of the things that helped me think about that was stuff that André Gortz, a French, radical, wrote in the early 70s, late 60s, I guess. And he put forward, the concept of non-reformist reforms, which, an elected left-wing government could implement. But he said what that will do is it's not going to do like Bernstein said, just leading to one step after another. It's going to create a crisis. And the capitalists are going to strike back. And of course, they got a lot of power that's outside the elected power structure. It's extra parliamentary. They can invest or not invest. Capital can go on strike too. And they can wreck the economy and blame the reformers. And if that doesn't work, they can send in, the intelligence services or the military. Think of Allende in Chile. So how do you respond to that? The party that's electing people also has to have a movement and be prepared to take direct action to defend those reforms and not let capital go on strike. If they go on strike, well, maybe we seize, the factory that's been, shut down by the capitalists. In other words, it's going to take more than just elections if you get to a revolutionary situation. So and I think that's what, Rosa Luxemburg was talking about, in her writings about the mass strikes and so forth. And I think that's what I think of when I think of the Second International. Now, the irony now is, I ran for president, and every damn progressive except a very few, was saying, drop out, back Biden. Or, Bill McKibben said, you should campaign for ranked choice voting, which I've been doing for decades, and we've actually we're making good progress on that right now, and proportional representation. But if I didn't even have the platform of running, I'm just another guy writing an article for Counterpunch or somebody. So I'm, in a situation where we're just trying to establish an independent left party in a system that's dominated by the two-party capitalist system, and you got this inherent thing in plurality, winner-take-all elections that creates the spoiler dilemma. And so, that's what we're up against. And what I'm saying is, we're just trying to establish ourselves as a party that's running people, whether they're reformists or revolutionaries. And we hadn't even got to a debate on reform versus revolution. So we're just trying to get to the point where the Second International was and have that debate.
All right, thank you guys. Let's get some questions. All right. One thing, Taylor, does the microphone here pick up the questions in the audience?
It should, yeah.
Okay.
Like, point it.
You could pass it
in
around.
direction.
Yeah. Or maybe you can keep that one here. We can use my phone to record.
Sure, I'll just point it in
Okay.
this direction. Yeah.
All right. Athena, please.
Yeah, I guess I have a question based on Eli and Howie, your responses just made about specifically fascism and reformism. Namely, I guess the reformist dispute or the revisionist dispute in some sense that was taken up, I think, by Rosa Luxemburg, I guess, is the question about a kind of incrementalism versus, revolution itself? Or I suppose, was the question posing the connection between the means and ends of socialist strategy? Namely, like what we see in the SPD acceding to power in Weimar Germany post World War I, in them, centralizing the labor, the labor republics to the state, in centralizing and putting down the Spartacus uprising, that at some level, taking control of, as Marx says, ready-made state machinery at some level sows the seeds of the movement's own self-undermining, which I suppose gets to my point or question about fascism, namely, is fascism a set of policy positions taken up by right-wing figures against, immigration towards racial nationalism? Or does fascism kind of describe a historical phenomena, like perhaps what Wilhelm Reich describes, in that it is a response to the failure of the people's demands in the form of socialism being taken up by the socialist parties?
You want to answer that?
I'm trying to absorb. There's a lot there.
I actually was to the doctor today and he told me I'm not contagious. We had a lot of exchange. I was going to come on Zoom, but I know it seems terrible. I'm coughing.
Don't worry, Mr. Zaretsky.
Fun.
Well, as you were speaking, one thing I was thinking of is that one of the reasons that the Social Democratic Party in Germany, signed off for the war credits, or most of them did, was to protect their own assets. They had become, they had huge assets. They had union halls and sports clubs and printing presses, and they were afraid if they didn't go along with the capitalists in supporting the war, that would all be taken from them. So they, and then after the war, Luxemburg and Liebknecht and those people were a threat to their power. So I think that's how you get to that situation. Now, how that relates to fascism. Your question is, fascism just a racial nationalism, or is it more than that? And you know, all I could think of then was, it is a lot, and it is a way to motivate people for, you know, authoritarian police states. But then I'm thinking, you know, I'm thinking of Pinochet in Chile, and you know, his wasn't so much a ethnic or racial thing; it was just authoritarian, and you know, we're against socialism, and we're with, you know, with the capitalists. So that's and then I'm thinking also, you know him, Ilya Zaretsky, who was, you know, theorized that Putin represents a new form of fascism, and there's not a mass fascist movement like Mussolini and Hitler had, but the content in terms of how the state treats the people is there, and it's partly like traditional fascism was, to repress threats to Putin's power, you know, from popular movements, whether it's the liberals around Navalny or Navalny or the, you know, people that were protesting what they saw as rigged elections, you know, about 12 years ago now. So I'm sort of thinking out loud about what fascism is and how the SPD, you know, relates to that.
I mean, fascism is very complicated. There's a lot of dispute about exactly what what fascism. Maybe a better term, it would be populism or authoritarian populism. For what we're facing now. I don't really. I do have to say on the question of Putin and Ukraine, I don't agree with you. I think the biggest danger to the world is the United States, without any question whatsoever. I think the United States is a fundamentally predatory. This we would have to understand. We have to look at, and there are Marxist ways of understanding it. We have to look at nation states and how they behave and so forth. The United States is basically bent on its own power, on world power. The reason that there's what's going on in Israel, Gaza, is we could have had a solution there a long time ago. Kissinger said over and over again, we're not going to have a solution because it would involve the Soviet Union. This would be in the 1970s. We're not going to have a solution. We're going to wipe out the Soviet Union, and then we'll have the control in the Middle East. We'll be able to do whatever we want. The reason we have Pinochet in Chile is because the CIA put down Allende. Again, Kissinger said Allende is much more dangerous than Castro because no one is really going to be attracted to Castro, but Allende is a democratic socialist. Democratic socialism is the real threat. We don't have to worry about communism. No one really is attracted to communism, and so forth. And as far as the Ukraine goes, the United States has aggressively what Gorbachev offered the world in 1990 was completely unprecedented. He offered the world genuine world peace. For the Soviet Union to set down its arms in 1990 and say, we need a common European homeland and so forth, and meaning a defensive treaty, a political alliance that brought together Russia and Europe, which, after all, Russia is historically part of Europe. Europe, Germany especially, is terribly dependent on Russia and so on. The United States constantly has forced the separation between Russia and Europe. It has expanded NATO against its promise not to do that in 1990, and now into Ukraine. And you go from country to country in the world. The other day, I was in a group on political fiction, and we read a book that you may know called Human Acts by a very famous Korean author named Wang. And she describes in this book the massacre of students in Korea, in South Korea, in 1980. Terrible. and she describes the students and the families and how terrible it was and so forth. And she doesn't mention the fact that it was the United States that trained the police of South Korea, put the police up, had the boats waiting outside Korea. And you can go every single country in the world practically outside of Western Europe and Canada and so forth, every country, you can go and find your police massacre that the United States put in place. The United States is the predatory force in the world today, not Putin.
Maybe just to navigate between both of your positions, on the subject of fascism, there are multiple definitions, whether philosophical or historical. I, being more of a historian by temperament, I do look upon it as a specific, largely along maybe your lines, as a specific historical phenomenon of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Primarily in Europe, that was dependent on a particular class configuration of forces, and that's not something, trans-historical philosophy that you can, or that you can find in the present day. So this is my, or anywhere else. So this is my debate with my friend, very, very close friend Eli Zaretsky, because I think Putin's regime is a, very far right economically, nationalist, but I wouldn't call it fascist, because to me, fascism doesn't exist today. They have, but on the subject of sorry, I don't want this to be about Putin, but I would just say that to me it helps to thinking of imperialism as also thinking of this category of sub-imperial powers, like which Russia is today vis-a-vis its neighbors, or Turkey is vis-a-vis its own neighbors. And if you happen to be in their proximity, if you happen to be Ukraine next to a larger revanchist power, which Russia is today, that is going to be your main enemy. But to me, the United States is still the world empire and the main source of oppression and devastation. But at the same time, I don't want this. If one is Kurd in northern Syria, if one is a Ukrainian, for you the ultimate oppressor is Turkey or Russia, or whatever sub-imperial power, which are no less predatory.
I'd like to come back on that.
I'm just worried because, I think a lot of people have questions, and I want to make sure we get everyone right quick. Yeah? All right. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Howie, do you want to finish?
I see one guy nodding. You're the moderator.
Yeah, go ahead then.
Okay, well, the expansion of NATO, after verbal agreements or statements to Gorbachev that U.S. wouldn't expand after Germany reunified, is predatory. The U.S. is the biggest imperialist power in the world, but Russia's an imperialist power too. Not just toward Ukraine, but, providing backup for police states like Assad's in Syria, and intervening in the civil war in Libya for oil concessions, or providing the muscle for dictators in the Central African Republic and Sudan in order to get mineral concessions, timber concessions. That's classic imperialist looting. It's a capitalist power. It's expansionist, and it's competing with the U.S. It's also cooperating in the multilateral management of global capitalism through the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and most ominously, I think, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which sets up these climate summits. And Russia and the U.S. and other petro states and big petrol consumers have prevented what most of the world wants, which is real commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, I think I would see Russia as a smaller imperialist power. And then when you come to Ukraine, you got to start with the people who live there, who don't want to be ruled by Putin's dictatorship. That, they suffered 3 centuries of Russian domination, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation. And you can go back to Voltaire, who talked about Ukraine, as a nation that's struggling to be free, but is caught between these empires. At that time, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the, Austria, what became the Habsburgs, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was an empire. So there's a long tradition there, and and then you talk to the left in Ukraine, and they say, yeah, we're worried about U.S. imperialism too. They're putting us in a debt trap. We're the northernmost country of the global south, and the debts are killing us. And the IMF, where the U.S. really has controlling interest, is not going to relieve them of their debts, which were incurred under oligarchs that were ruling Ukraine before the Maidan Revolution, and they still are dealing with those oligarchs. So what they say is we're fighting Russian tanks and Western banks, and I'm saying we should be in solidarity, particularly with the progressive forces, the trade unions, the socialists, the anarchists, the Green Party, the environmentalists in Ukraine who are fighting for their freedom, and they see it as a two-front struggle. Russia, invasion is obviously immediate, but they recognize that if reconstruction is conducted under, the auspices of, what's her name, Pritzker's now coordinating that for Biden, and BlackRock is like coordinating the financing. I mean, it's going to be predatory lending, and Ukraine is going to be in debt to the West. They don't want that either. So I think we should be in solidarity, and they have every right to get arms from wherever they can get them to defend themselves. And they need economic aid. I mean, there's a lot of economic aid. About half of what we sent them has been economic. If they don't get that, they're broke. They can't pay their teachers, their healthcare workers, let alone their soldiers. Anyway.
I was very struck by all of the speakers, particularly Howie, your anecdote about the leap to the left and the kind of disputes in early days of the SDS, the sort of new left's presence on the panel. Rossen, you even seem to say that Marxism, insofar as it exists in the post-Soviet states, is really kind of relearning through encounter with Western Marxists, like David Harvey, figures of the new left. Or just Murray Bookchin, kind of his presence here is an example of that. And I guess, in my life, I've seen, the most major example would be like the DSA demand reforms like Medicare for all and justify it or think of it as kind of in continuity with the legacy of groups like SDS, right, who some of our panelists were protagonists in. But which Howie, at least you said, is kind of forgetting the critical aspect of the new left. Or, for example, in New York, just last year, the New School occupied their building, right? And this was seen as, pursuing the same tactics as, like the Columbia occupation or these new left student tactics, right? Although they may not even realize it, right? And so I guess for all of you, why is it that the new left is remembered this way now? What do you think is lost about the way in which the new left is remembered and used to justify the present? And if the new left was a kind of critical rethinking of what Marxism or the left could be, what are the possibilities for that now?
I mean, it just shows that how much vitality there is to the left and how they can't destroy it, no matter how often, how much they try, and how many classes you're going to take in political science and economics and history and so forth that are going to tell you that, this is the only way liberalism, the market, this is the only science, so-called science. That's what, I mean, the New Left was it was just a fantastic moment. And it was a fantastic moment in Marxism, among other things, but it was way beyond Marxism. I mean, it brought us feminism and gay liberation and ecology and participatory democracy. The New Left was fantastic. And I think, I'm negative about the world, but, I'm not negative about our students and so forth. I believe, and we keep learning and we keep developing and so forth. No one can talk, I mean, you could say Stalin was a Marxist. Okay, fine, Stalin was a Marxist, but no one could talk, claim to be a Marxist or really a leftist today that doesn't incorporate the lessons of the New Left, like participatory democracy, like feminism. Can you imagine a leftist who is not a feminist? So, I mean, it's kind of simple-minded, but
This might be a vulgar thing to say, but if the New Left was such a success, why do we still live in capitalism?
well, no, I mean, it's a very short history. The Roman Empire was 1,000 years, 800 years, depending how you want to measure it. China was a couple of thousand years. Capitalism, it's only 200 years old, and it toys with our deaths all the time. And I do agree with what Howard said about one of these days they're going to blow things up. It's an extremely dangerous time. Human nature is not rational. Human nature is not, I mean, if human beings were like robots and just like artificial intelligence, they would just figure out, socialism makes a lot more sense. They would just institute, socialism. Human beings are deeply irrational. They have all sorts of prejudices. They do suicidal things all the time. We live in an extremely dangerous time because, on the one hand, you have all of these let's call them authoritarian populist movements, are the dominant movements in the world, that are just mobilizing against immigrants, against minorities. And then you have, look what's going on with the election in the United States. You have Trump, and then you have Biden, who is basically saying, vote for me because otherwise you're going to get Trump. And that's sort of the situation in the world, that the liberals are, a very, very weak alternative. That's, why is... It's like possibly our species won't last because we're not smart enough to handle the kind of problems that have been released on the world. That's the whole thing about capitalism, is it's such a powerful force technologically and economically. It releases so much power, and you don't have remotely the kind of socially organized intelligence that's necessary to deal with it. That's what we just saw with artificial intelligence. We see that. That's what we see with capitalist wars.
It seems to me, even though I hesitate to speak about the New Left, given that I'm surrounded by
New leftists.
yes, and I wasn't even born at the time, but it was a left that operated in vastly different historical circumstances than we are, and there are limits to which its experiences can be appropriated by today's left. obviously the Soviet bloc, it wasn't called the New Left, but socialism with a human face, but it did share a basic, the same yearning of synthesizing democracy and socialism, which was common also to the New Left, which had at least a form of democracy in the society it was living in, but much less by way of socialism. And obviously the left in the global south had a somewhat different character, with anti-colonial movements, but it was a left somewhat common global moment, and yet specifically for Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, many of the representatives of this socialism with a human face seem to have gone in vastly different political directions, and very fewer. Unlike I think the American New Left, which had its many defectors, but we still have also many active leftists from that moment. But in the Second World, the socialists with the human face seem to have been massively disenchanted with the left, and so it's very difficult for us to in any way connect with them politically. Anyway,
I mean, my impression, I don't mean, just very quickly, my impression is that a lot of the people who were active in the New Left, I was active in the New Left. I was in those SDS conference in 1988, 68, 69, and so forth. I was very active in the New Left, and so I kind of grew old with those people. And, most of the people I know remained leftists. There were one or two, there's David Horowitz, moved to the right. But, there were some people who were consistently strong liberals, like Michael Walzer. But the people I knew, like Barbara Ehrenreich and Todd Gitlin and so forth, who I knew were in the New Left, they were New Leftists until they died, one way or another. I don't know. I mean, it's just an impression. I could be wrong.
Well, I think Eli is right that the New Left contributions that have endured are the way it addressed questions that couldn't be reduced to class. Like some of the old left, a lot of the old left, whether social democratic or communist, really couldn't handle, including anti-racism and decolonization, and women's and gay liberation, and ecology. And one of the things, though, I think we've lost is the disarmament movement was the nuclear disarmament movement. Big impetus for the New Left was people like E.P. Thompson in the mid-50s. That's where the term originally came from, and we kind of attached it to what we were doing too, but that is something that needs to be on the forefront, given all that's going on in the world today. It should be at the top. In any case, that stuff carried forward. I think what you were referring to is the New Left's critique of New Deal programs. And I think the reason that people today, when they think of that period, they look at the highlights, the headlines, the sit-ins, the occupations, the shootouts between the police and the Panthers. But, what the New Left was more about was, these policies I described, like, moving to a national health service under community control as opposed to national health insurance, what we call Medicare for All. And Barbara Ehrenreich was one of those people. In fact, I think she wrote the editorial that first called national health insurance the Great Leap Sideways, with a group called Health PAC, Health Policy Advisory Committee here in New York City. So that's I think something we need to revive. And the tactics, the other thing, like, I came up in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Panther Party got a lot of attention for their armed patrols and later for the shootouts. But what I remember was, and this was early on, there's a elementary school in North Oakland called Salem Elementary, and kids kept getting run over by people because they needed a stoplight there, and the community kept asking for a stoplight. Finally, the Panthers went over there. They had rifles over their shoulder, but they started directing the traffic when the kids were let out from school. And that so embarrassed city council that stoplight was up very quickly. And I later learned that in Corona, Queens, the Panthers there did the same thing to get a stoplight where there's now I was in there, as a library, I think, attached to a school. I was at an event there. So, you know, those kind of activities were also, and then, you know, there's a lot of community organizing efforts to, you know, a lot of the people that, you know, if you get trained in community organizing today, you'll be trained by people that learn their craft in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and then with the United Farm Workers. So I guess I'm saying a lot more of the New Left is with us. What I'm saying we're missing is that New Left critique of the New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, just on the same point, I think that in some ways, certainly one of the greatest legacies of the New Left, and one of the greatest movements of the New Left was feminism. And of course, you know, we don't realize that because a small number of feminists, and we're really a minority, said the New Left was sexist, it was a rape culture, you know, and so forth. But in fact, you know, feminism is one of the greatest emancipatory movements. Of course it's part of the left. When you realize that feminism and gay liberation and so forth and many aspects of what is today called wokeness, which is really has a kind of spiritual awakening element, so much of that came out of the New Left. And when you realize that, and you don't let a very handful of, you know, basically neoliberal feminists define what the nature of feminism was. And I think if you read feminist literature today, it's full of leftism and socialism. So, I mean, when you look at that, wow, what a great period in the history of the left.
Yeah, I was just, well, first of all, thank you all for speaking. Really good. Thank you all. I was curious, like, given that we talked about First International, Second, Third International, New Deal, New Left, like a lot of history has been covered here. And, you know, we've talked about some of the accomplishments of those movements: ecology, feminism, gay liberation, participatory democracy. But obviously, like, those aren't communism, right? And capitalism has only gotten stronger. I think in the working class has only gotten weaker over time. And we like to think that we've learned from this history, right? So I guess my question would more be, given that history and given the accomplishments that we have, do you, as like an intellectual and someone who studies Marxism, do you think that there is an end of capitalism? Do you think there's a revolutionary future? And if so, what in this historical trajectory makes you think that that's even a possibility as capitalism seems to continue to become stronger, no matter how many leftist movements we have and how many small victories or moral victories we gain?
I mean, I very much agree with Eli that we should expand our time scales and yes, not. I mean, I personally grew up at a time of, and still have always lived at a time of retreat of the left and victories of capitalism. I was born in '79. One of my first conscious memories around the age of 10 was the end of state socialism, and you know, that was followed by the full-on transition to capitalism. But so you know, it has been defeat after defeat. As far as my lifetime has been concerned, but at the same time, you know, we have to remember that Lenin wrote, I think in 1915, that about the prospects of socialist revolution in Russia. Not, it's not going to be in my lifetime. And within 2 years of that, he was, leading one such
Creating the checkup.
yes, that too. But so really, capitalism does create all these crises now at an increasing rate. That Eli he spoke. Marx himself, I think, in the Communist Manifesto, he speaks of a sorcerer who's lost control of his magic. It's really a very powerful figure, and yes, we do not know what crises it will lead to in the United States, specifically. Capitalism is, immensely strong, immensely rooted, both institutionally in civil society, in the minds of people. But there are places where it is less rooted. But yes, it's very hard to predict the future, and we should be really ready for it. Because unless we are ready to seize those opportunities that are offered by crises.
I mean, the Second International was founded in 1889, and then 1917, revolution's on the table. But it seems like, at least Eli and you seem as well to be suggesting it might take 1,000 years.
Sure. Look, I mean, part of what I was trying to say before about what is Marxism, that it's a quintessentially historical conception of capitalism. Well, of course it'll come to an end. It's an it's an historical form. I mean, the Chinese Empire came to an end. The Roman Empire came to an end. Capitalism will come. Of course, it'll come to an end. Yeah, it might take hundreds of years and so forth. Except that we see the acceleration of technology and so forth is so dramatic and so rapid that we're really basically facing a civilizational emergency. So that's another thing. The use of the term revolution, as Lenin and those people thought of revolution, I mean, I think of a revolution, I think revolution in two different ways. I think we need it. Excuse me. An intellectual revolution. I think we need to think things through at the deepest possible, in a revolutionary way. That's what Marxism is. It's a revolutionary, it's radical in the sense that Murray Bookchin talked about radical, going to the root. It goes to the root. The root is capitalism. The root is how, what it is and so forth. We don't need to be cautious thinkers. We need to be radical, and if you wish, revolutionary thinkers. But that doesn't mean we're going to have a revolution in the sense of grabbing the means of production and getting control of the TV stations and so forth. I don't know. I'm not sure that anything like that is going to happen.
Well, I'm more optimistic.
About that?
Yeah, about that. I think one thing, just to consider the strength of the working class today. It's more literate, educated, and more, tolerant and liberal in the sense that feminism and anti-racism, and, you can just look at attitude surveys, certainly in this country, and I think around the world. So, we're moving in a progressive direction in that respect. And then look at the political culture. We just went through a period, it's been called the revolutions of the squares. The Arab Spring, everybody went to the, Central Square. They did it in Turkey. We did it at, Occupy Wall Street. The Maidan Revolution, Independence Square in Kyiv. That's kind of part of the political culture. People know how to protest. They know how to organize. They see it around. And we have this international media, so it's people learn from each other. So I think that's all on a positive side. But, these kind of movements, you just can't be a revolutionary party and say, okay, I get called by people because I ran for president. They say, will you join us in a group to start a general strike? And I say, well, which unions have you got involved? Well, we'll go talk to them. You know, it's like just a few people think they can just snap their fingers and issue the call, and everybody's gonna say, oh, why didn't we think of that? It doesn't work that way. I mean, these things, the upsurges get started. It's often police brutality. You know, look at that massive movement. Some say the biggest movement we ever had after George Floyd was murdered. It was the same thing at the Maidan revolution in Kyiv. You know, students came out in particular because they wanted the European Association, and they had their own class interests in that. And then the police came in and beat the crap out of them. And then it went from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands because people said, you don't, you know, beat up our children like that. And it became more than just about oriented to Russia or the West, but, you know, kleptocracy, oligarchy, repression. So it often gets started by the police acting wrong, repression. So, you know, what should the left do? Because we can't just call forth these uprisings. I think we've got to be an educational force so that when the uprisings do come, the ideas are already there among the people. I mean, just to give an example in my experience, you know, in the mid-60s, we, you know, protest the war, and we were called commies and, you know, misfits, and, you know, and we were marginal. And then after Tet Offensive, I came up in a neighborhood with a lot of auto workers. I worked in this big auto factory in Fremont, California. And they're all World War II veterans, pretty much. And they're all very patriotic. They're all for the war in Vietnam. Until that Tet Offensive. And, you know, some of their kids are coming back disturbed, some dead. But, you know, saying, you know, we shouldn't be there. And then the Tet Offensive and Walter Cronkite said we're losing the war. And it was like, you know, you see a flock of birds or a school of fish all of a sudden together make a turn. That's what happened. They all came out against the war after that, you know, 68. And, you know, it just spread. And I think they were already thinking about it because the anti-war movement was getting to them. And sometimes I think we're changing people's minds when they don't even know it themselves. They haven't admitted to themselves. But then when, you know, the peer group moves, they all move with it. So what I'm saying is if we, you know, have the leftist ideas out there, when, you know, when opportunities come, they can be picked up by the movements.
I agree with that. You know, individuals make a huge difference. Roosevelt could have easily led the country to the right in 1932, and they would have gone. Every place else went to the right. I mean, that's Germany had, you know, Hitler and so forth. I mean, but he didn't. He led the country, and that led the world for a while. You know, the defeat of Nazism. And in my view, Obama could have led everything to the left if he had had the guts and the brains and the knowledge to do it. And I think it was a historic failure. That was a moment when you saw the defeat of the U.S. in Iraq, the disaster of Iraq, and the global economic crisis all converging together in the election of the first black president, which is a result of the New Left, incidentally, which was, you know, the civil rights movement and so forth. That was such an enormous moment, and he decided that what was important was, you know, to get back to where we were, to have moderate reforms. We got Obamacare, true, and so forth. So individuals make a huge difference in history. Hitler, you know, and so forth.
Even mass media was...
Gorbachev. The Soviet Union, could still be throwing tanks into Eastern Europe. Go on.
I was just going to say, the mass media was expecting Obama to give us a new deal and rooting for it. It was amazing in that period.
Everybody
you know.
was waiting, the New Deal,
Yeah.
absolutely. But, you know.
He bailed out Wall Street. Then we're at Occupy saying, banks got bailed out, we got sold out. That was the Obama policy.
I see a question in the back.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I guess, because I've been thinking about one thing that sort of came up during some of your remarks was the relationship of Marxism, like the relationship in Marxism and the state, and the way that Marxism thought about the state. So I know Eli had talked about the Soviet Union. I know, like, state socialism has come up a couple times in panel. I know Eli said, you know, there's no excuses. He stressed the importance of, like, liberal rights, individual rights against the state. We also talked about, on the other hand, the New Deal, the welfare state, and how, and she said, showed what the government could do. Well, in the kind of contrary, I guess, like Howie mentioned how the New Left had this critique of the welfare state, that it's not just that, like, the gains, whatever they are, the welfare state can be, like, overturned, but the welfare state itself is a sort of, like, bureaucratic entity that's sort of out of control of the population. And there also is this kind of, like, broader sort of, like, Marxist critique of the state, which also converges with possibly, like, an anarchist critique of the state. And he mentioned state and revolution. And so I guess I wanted to ask, what is, like, how did Marxism understand the role of the state under capitalism? The state as, for example, a manager of capitalism or not? And I don't know, how do you understand the role of the state under capitalism and how to approach it as a Marxist, or how Marxists should approach it?
Yes, I mean, just to continue Eli's point about there being very, very little by way of theory of the state in Marx and even Engels' writing. There is this phrase in the Communist Manifesto about the state being the committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. There is a mention of within Marx of a dictatorship of the proletariat as a kind of an intermediate stage, but really Marx wasn't a theorist of the state, and it was for later Marxists, including Lenin, as mentioned, the state and revolution, but especially to me, Gramsci has been still the most fruitful thinker of a capitalist state, and the way it absorbs, it can absorb revolutionary pressure through civil society, through hegemony, and so it is really the testimony to the creativity of Marxists after Marx that a theory of the state was developed, and now it's a significant branch of Marxist thought, which was really absent with the founders.
Well, just briefly, I would say, and I mentioned this before, Marx and Engels were inconsistent on what they envisioned for a socialist state or a worker state. A lot of times it was a centralized state, to plan and suppress the counter-revolution. But then the Paris Commune, very different vision, more like the anarchist vision. And, having worked with and learned from Murray Bookchin a lot, I think the idea that you need direct democracy at the base, assemblies of the people, and then they have elected and recallable representation, the legislative councils, is the form through which we can exercise political and economic democracy. I think it's interesting to see what's going on in northeast Syria, Rojava, where the radical Kurds, in cooperation with some of the other ethnic groups, are trying to implement that. So anyway, that's where I come out on the question of the state. That's really what we should be, and in prefiguring that, and this is something Murray Bookchin argued for, radicals should be running, for local office, including in their platform, rewriting city and town charters to allow for assembly democracy in a federation at the city or town level, where the councilors are accountable to the assemblies.
But Howie, earlier you mentioned 1848, and you said that it teaches us that the workers need their own party. 1848 was also like the democratic election of a socialist in France, right? Right, Louis Bonaparte was democratically elected, right? So I guess my question is, that's democracy, that's socialism. Like, why do we still...
Who was elected in 1848 as socialist?
Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, he wasn't a socialist.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was.
No, he wasn't.
That was socialism.
No,
He was a socialist.
No, he wasn't. He is no.
Was he a fascist?
No, he was a state planner. He organized the housemen. Destroying the workers' control of the city, building up the department stores, building up the boulevards, power for the banks, finance, created Mobilier, Suez Canal, imperialism. He was a state planner. He was definitely not a socialist. I mean, that was Marx's book. The 18th Brumaire is about the so-called revolution of 1848, where which comes in Louis Napoleon winning the election, but he's not a socialist.
He wasn't a Marxist. I mean, I know people in the DSA today that would say, from a policy perspective.
Louis Blanc, are you thinking of Louis Blanc?
No. But I know people today that would say that FDR was a socialist, for instance.
Well, I could see. I mean, he wasn't, but I've never heard. I don't know. I've never heard Louis Napoleon described as socialist.
That's what he described himself as.
Maybe. Well, of course, Hitler was a national socialist. But anyway. But what are you saying? The point that let's not get into the
Sure.
details. What is the point that you're making? Is that socialism can be democratically elected?
I'm saying that maybe, like, you guys were talking about the state and how Marx doesn't have a theory of the state. And I'm saying maybe Marx does have a theory of the state, and Bonapartism is part of that. And that maybe Marx considered that, democracy might elect a socialist, and that might not be sufficient to bring about a socialist revolution.
Marx was a great fan of Abraham Lincoln. He covered the Civil War for the newspapers, and he thought that you might get socialism through small private property, the way we had in the United States with the abolition of slavery and so forth. He underestimated the power of American capital to keep racism going because it was profitable. You had the alliance between Northern capital and the Southern racism just continued up until the 1960s. Marx was very open to, and so was Engels. They were open to, nobody, they didn't say it has to be a violent revolution and so forth.
I mean, Trotsky was a Marxist. I mean,
for sure.
And you're saying Stalin might have also been a Marxist. I think
Sure.
you all said. I mean, if Marxism isn't just like a set of like, I believe like that capitalism is bad or something. Like, I don't know, maybe like there's within, just without having to refer to like external, the New Left or other kind, like I guess, was Stalin a Marxist? Puts on the table like what is Marxism? Like, because if Stalin's a Marxist and Trotsky's a Marxist, it doesn't seem like they can both be Marxists at the same time.
Well, they come from the same intellectual tradition, the conclusions they reach are radically different.
Mussolini was a socialist. Then he became
Right.
a fascist.
Right.
Well, one thing this whole discussion brings up is, and I've had this debate with so many people, they denigrate democratic elections and, things like free speech and political rights as bourgeois democracy. And that's not what Marx and Engels were talking about. When they talked about a capitalist state not being democratic, they were talking about the class character of the state, that the state was controlled by the capitalists, even if, in their day there weren't a lot of elections, but even if there were elections, it was a state that they controlled. And, Marx in particular, throughout his life, but, from the beginning, was an advocate for, freedom of the press and free speech and, expanding the franchise so more
Right.
people could vote. And, if you look at the history of how democracy spread through Europe, it was the workers' movement, the socialist movement,
Right.
that won it. So I just, one of my pet peeves is people, so-called quote-unquote Marxist-Leninists say, oh, that's just bourgeois democracy. And, one very prominent leftist, and I don't know if I want to say his name and get in debate about him, but recently just dismissed elections as, not what revolutionary governments are concerned about. They're concerned about keeping the power once they get it. From a guy that's considered a Marxist and a member of a major Marxist party in the world. That's not helping us. I mean, that's like we were talking about earlier, people, the Soviet Union was not an attractive model. Allende, a democratically elected socialist, was. And that's, we got to keep that,
I wrote a book called Why America Needs a Left, and America has one of the weakest Marxist traditions in the world, and it has one of the strongest leftist traditions in the world. It's fantastic. We led the new left. The United States created the new left, and it became a global movement. The abolitionists are the first American left. You know how incredible the abolitionists. What do they want? They integrated the elementary schools. They integrated the churches in the 1840s. They were fantastic. So it's and we had the New Deal, which then led to women voting in Japan and supporting trade unions in Japan. It led to the democratization of Germany after World War II. So the U.S. Has had a fantastic left. It's because of the left that we've done those things. It has a fantastic left and a very, very weak Marxism. Murray Bookchin is an example. He's not a Marxist, he's an anarchist, but he's a great American leftist.
But, like, Howie, if you were elected president, or if the RCP, if they were managed to somehow score president, like, would it change anything? I mean, and you mentioned this yourself, like, there were these great socialist movements, right? And I guess, like, now there really isn't any sort of movement at all. And so...
Well, I mean, what I would say if I was elected is what Bernie Sanders was saying if he was elected. How's he going to get things through? He says he's got to have a political revolution, a movement behind him, that to exercise that extra parliamentary power when the powers that be exercise their extra governmental power. If the RCP was in power, they'd put me in jail as a dissident.
I mean, but, a general strike maybe, question.
Yeah. This, okay.
Oh, yeah,
Yes,
Evan,
we're
you
gonna-
had your hand up for a while, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got to wrap up soon as well.
Okay.
Maybe, Evan, because we're getting to time, let's take both of your questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
this-
Evan, go ahead.
I'll definitely have to leave
Okay.
that.
I guess I just want to bring it back to like the prompt, like what is Marxism? And I was wondering, Eli, if you could help, if you could like clarify or specify kind of the meaning of Marxism, because it seemed at least at the beginning you were saying that it was like something particular, something specific, as opposed to it being more like expansive and.
Well, I'm distinguishing Marxism and the left.
Right.
So the left is very broad, it's very expansive. So the abolitionists are an example of the American left.
Yeah.
The New Deal is an example of American leftist thinking, the creative role of government, like Karl was saying, and so forth. And so Marxism is a conception of capitalism. Marxism is an intellectual and in some ways moral force within the left that foregrounds the issue of capitalism. It will say this is good, this is great, and so forth, but to really solve this problem, we have to deal with capitalism, or maybe not.
Yeah, when you were talking about how like economic analysis is sort of like inadequate.
It's not,
Or it's not like it's not an adequate sort of
Right.
description of what Marxism is. As a whole,
Right.
And that it should be like construed as like social theory. And I was wondering if you could explain why Marxism as like an economic analysis is inadequate. Like, and I just want to raise a kind of like a letter that Marx wrote to Wedemeyer, where he says that the only contribution that he made was the
distinguishing.
The necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Oh no, he didn't say that. Did he say that?
And
Oh.
and I do have another question. Can I ask another question? Sorry,
Yeah,
I know
sure.
I'm taking a lot of time.
No, go ahead.
There was also a conversation, kind of a big conversation about like the stagnation of the working class, like the working class being kind of weaker now and being more passive, right, and not like connected with the intellectuals. So there's like a question about how intellectuals should sort of relate to the working class, and a feeling that there really is no kind of relationship there. And
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go on. Finish.
And I was just wondering sort of like what intellectuals, like what leftist intellectuals or Marxists specifically might contribute to like working class struggles. For example, Lenin said that workers on their own could not, could only achieve trade union consciousness. And so like what does that mean then about like, how does that clarify kind of the necessity of the intellectuals and what they contribute to the
Well, he wouldn't have said, what Lenin was saying is that you need a party of professional revolutionaries. That's not necessarily the same as intellectuals. Professional revolutionaries have, by themselves, workers will only just do, the everyday thing, which is trade unionism and so forth. To understand socialism, you have to have a revolutionary party, a party of professional intellectuals who will bring the ideas of socialism to the working class. I don't agree that the working class today is weak. On the contrary, I think it's incredibly aroused and powerful and so forth. It's a different working class. It's a very large role of women and immigrants, but we live in a time of terrific trade union militancy and so forth. The intellectuals are a real question, and I really don't understand what happened, because basically the American intellectual class as a social class in Gramsci's sense, an organic class, organic to the mode of production, to the capitalist mode of production. It basically is created in the 1920s with mass production and so forth, and it was totally on the left from the time that it was created until the 60s or 70s. And the intellectuals in America, it's bankrupt to a great extent. And I don't know why. I don't understand what happened. Like in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and so forth, all the intellectuals, it was just common sense that if you were intellectual, of course you would be on the left. You'd be against big business. You'd, be in favor of the improvement of the conditions and the mass of the people, and so forth. And then, I don't know, they swallowed the Kool-Aid and just went the whole, markets and rational choice and game theory and just all this vacuous, empty, or post-structuralism. I don't want to be too negative, but.
Well, I can say,
I want to hear Rossen hasn't spoken in a minute. I'd like to hear.
Or maybe I can follow up.
Sure, sorry.
How we.
I was just going to say briefly, I remember Murray Bookchin talking about how we went from intellectuals who were, public intellectuals, they might have been, writers, journalists, librarians, to them becoming institutionalized in academia, which was increasingly, funded by government and big business, and kind of institutionalized the conservatism. That was his observation. That happened, post World War II particularly.
Yes, just to follow up, it is a specific, this relationship of the working class and intellectuals is a specific problem to Marxist intellectuals rather than intellectuals on the left, because for Marxists it is the working class that should be in the leadership of the party and this vanguard class, and yet which is not necessarily the analysis for many other parts of the left. But I'm actually more optimistic for this moment, precisely because of this increasing working class militancy that expresses itself in this country in particular in the form of strikes for the last several months. And on part of the intellectuals, I am also heartened by the rise of the graduate student labor movement, of which I am myself a product, which produces intellectuals who also think of themselves as workers, and it produces alliances such as United Auto Workers, which is 20% made up of graduate students, and who ended up voting for the reformist leadership and enabling the subsequent strike. And there were so many graduate students actually going to in solidarity to auto dealerships, to picket lines, and so I think at least as far as my little corner of academia is concerned, there is a really much greater interest in working class, in the working class, and in re-articulating a kind of an alliance that was lost at some point in the late 20th century.
Okay, I'd like to take Taylor's question and then just get some final remarks from you guys and call it a day.
Yeah, because I should go, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I just want to pick up on a few things. One being, you, at least Eli and Howie, you both have sort of talked about some of the victories of the left over the past, 50 years since the new left, and also this problem of Marxism being maybe insufficient. I think Eli, you said that Marxism by itself is not enough.
Right.
Howie, you said something similar. So the question would be, what is the left trying to achieve? What is the left's goal? You've cited these things as victories, gay liberation, black liberation, women's rights, these things. What is the left's goal, and why is Marxism insufficient? What is the deficit of Marxism in order to achieve that goal? And we've cited things like, Stalin, the gulags, maybe it's too authoritarian, maybe it had these blind spots, it wasn't sensitive enough to identity groups. So just to reiterate, what is the left trying to achieve? Why is Marxism insufficient to doing that? And why have adding all of these things, supposedly, that Marxism was deficient in, like the New Left has tried to account for these blind spots, yet it seems that we're further from revolution than, further from attaining socialism, if that's what we say the goal of the left is, further from that today than we've ever been.
I don't know that we're further than we've ever been. I mean, in fact, if chronology, means anything, we're closer. Time goes on, but the reason there's a left, there just seems to be something in human nature. Maybe not in everybody. It's just like the whole world is organized by people who dominate other people. They use every means they can. Capitalism is the most sophisticated system of domination that has ever been created, because it doesn't appear to be domination. It appears like, it's just the market. It's not my fault. It's not like you don't see the direct domination. I don't think there's anything wrong with Marxism. Marxism is a very rich, full, living body of thought. You can spend your whole life just reading the Marxist classics and not finish. So I don't think there's anything in Marxism, in spite of what you said about his letter to Wedemeyer. I thought he said the only thing I'm responsible for is the distinction between labor and value, or what is it, labor and labor time. But I didn't know he said that, dictate, I believe you. But I don't think there's anything inherently authoritarian in Marxism. I don't think there's anything about private property in the sense that capitalists have private property that is necessary for human freedom. I don't think it's necessary that the Koch brothers, own, mountains and oil mines and beaches and everything like that in order that there be freedom. That's like bullshit, to think anything like that. But you have to be, Marxism is not a religion. If you were, let's say, Thomas Merton, who went to a monastery and converted to Catholicism, his entire world was organized around Catholicism, around Christ, around praying, about his relationship to God, and so on. Marxism is not like that. You'd have to be an idiot not to open your mind to all of the great thinkers that have taught us so much since Marx. To me, Freud, without any question, Max Weber and so forth, while Gramsci's a Marxist. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, the left's goal, I think, the values of the left, realizing those values is the goal. And, the French Revolution summed it up pretty well. Liberty, equality. They said fraternity. Later, some of the women, like at the Paris Commune, were saying, let's replace fraternity with solidarity or community. So then, the left analysis is, well, capitalism deprives us of those things, and we need the full political and economic democracy of socialism. That's the vision. So to me, that's what the left is about. And are we further from it? We got the problem of Stalinism, and the legacy of the repressive state socialist, or called bureaucratic collectivists, depending on your theory, that made socialism a bad word, certainly in this country, many other Western countries, certainly in the post-Soviet countries, given their experience of it. And people tried to substitute other words, but socialism has a tradition, that's democratic, that I guess, we need to revive. And as to whether it's further away, like I was saying earlier, I think, as they say, the objective conditions are there. We got big problems. We got a working class that is more capable of self-government because of literacy and self-education and experience, and the ability to share experiences in today's communications. So that's why I'm more optimistic than maybe some people are.
Fine. Well, yes, I'm also on the mild optimism part of the spectrum. I see both in the students I teach, and I have been teaching a course on Marxism for a relatively short period, 7 years, but I see a great interest in the topic among my students. I see a much greater interest in Marxism in my little corner of the humanities, where, yes, many post-structuralist theories which were dominant, are receding, and I have a greater number of colleagues working on Marxism. Yes, there is, at least in the United States, this at least in the last year or so, much greater resurgence in labor unrest. So the forces of socialism, I mean, if not necessarily Marxism, the forces of socialism in general are increasing, but the forces of barbarism are increasing at a far faster rate. Whether it is Trump in the States or the equivalents which are cropping up at an alarming speed worldwide. So to me, this question of socialism or barbarism has a new urgency, and for now, even though socialism is growing, the growth rate of barbarism is far higher, and which is a source of some alarm and a greater urgency for our collective task.